So as we look at the questions here about the Facebook post, Jesus was Jewish in his practice, not Christian as we think of it today. Where he's going to return is really something we don't know, and we should be careful not to speculate about that. The Scripture's intended neither to give us the time nor the place of his arrival. Talking about the final battle, well, there's not a final battle in the sense that we think. We are in the spiritual battle, and last time that was kind of what we went through, right? Our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against the powers, authorities, the principalities, the spiritual forces of evil, right? That is what the battle. And that is why when the Apostle Paul in Ephesians 6 talks about putting on the full armor of God, it's not literal armor. It is the breastplate of righteousness. It's the helmet of salvation. It's the sword of the Spirit, because Christians are not fighting those kinds of battles. And sometimes Christians in history have gotten a little bit militant, and they've confused these two things a little bit, and that's never been good for us. It's never been good for the world either. We should be careful not to confuse our mission to take the spiritual battle with the Word of God to the world and against the powers of the devil with some kind of an attempt to create a physical utopia, which all utopian plans come to nothing, but that doesn't mean people don't keep still trying. So we're down to the one that talks about God did not replace the Jews. That's where we're going to be here today, and some passages there. So it's really kind of the last section we're going to touch upon for the post, and then I want to talk a little bit before the class ends up here today about what we call just war doctrine. We'll answer some of the questions that are in the concept here. Is the current war between Israel and Hamas an indication of Jesus' return? And then visit just some just war doctrine. So go through the slides here. All right, so this is the issue at hand. God did not replace the Jews with Christians, as some believe. We are actually grafted in with them as you would graft a wild branch into an existing tree. Does anybody recognize the verbiage there at all? What's being talked about? Does that register with you at all? So this picture of being grafted is one that the Apostle Paul picks up in Romans chapter 11. The first part of the book of Romans through chapter 8 is the Apostle Paul's defense of justification by grace through faith. And then before he gets into what we call the practical section of the letter, in which he starts to take up issues of Christian living, at chapter 12, he spends 3 chapters talking about what happened with the Jewish nation. And the fact that while in the Old Testament God had made them his elect people and had chosen them out of all the people of the world to have this special place in his plan of salvation, from them would come the Savior of the world, yet Paul and the disciples, who were themselves all Jewish, recognized that the gospel was taking hold among Gentile people much faster than it was taking hold among Jewish people. There was a remnant of believers that God was going to preserve for himself, as he always had, among those who were Jewish. And the Jews are still a part of the all nations to whom the gospel is to be sent. When Jesus sent the disciples out on Ascension Day, he told them, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria, and then to the uttermost ends of the earth." But the time of that special place that they had in God's design had more or less come to an end, and now God was folding the two groups into one new thing in the church. And the Facebook post here doesn't exactly get that. So we are grafted in with them as you would graft a wild branch into an existing tree. That's not exactly what Paul says in Romans chapter 11. So here's Paul's words describing this. Romans 11, 17 to 21. If some of the branches have been broken off, and you, though a wild shoot, have been grafted in among the others and now share in the nourishing sap from the olive root, do not boast over those branches. So who would the branches that were broken off be?
People are rejected. Yeah.
And from what ethnic group?
Jews.
That would be the Jewish, the Jews who had been broken off. So it's not a picture as though the Jewish faith and place in God's economy of things just continues as it was, but by and large, those branches were broken off. Now, there was some that remained, a remnant, The root is really the biblical faith, which precedes the Jewish people, right? The biblical faith goes to Adam and Eve. It goes back to the believing son Seth. It goes back to the genealogies leading up to Noah. It goes from Noah to Abraham. It goes from Abraham through the patriarchs, Isaac and Jacob. And then up to Moses. But until, Abraham, you don't have the Jews as a people. You've got a single family. Noah was not Jewish, right? Noah was just part of whatever the world was at that point in time. And the same for the genealogy back. The Jewish people start essentially with Abraham and his family. And then Israel as a nation, not really, as a whole nation, has this official relationship with God until Mount Sinai. That's where God ratifies his special covenant that they would be, as a people, the chosen people. You had the earlier promises to Abraham for his family. Now that family had expanded to nationhood, and from Sinai to Christ, you've got that special relationship. So if you do consider this, you do not support the root, but the root supports you. So yes, we Christians, what this tells us about Christian faith is it is the original religion. Right? It's not like a new religion started with Jesus. Jesus simply fulfilled a major step in the religion that goes back to Adam and Eve. And the Jewish people had occupied that faith for most of time. We are a part of that same faith. And because it's a faith, it's not about the ethnic group so much. Even in Old Testament times, there were various non-Jewish people who got brought into that faith. So you know the story of Ruth. Anybody from Sunday school remember where Ruth was from? Moabites, right? Moab. Which is kind of cousins. Moab, that was from Lot's daughters. So kind of cousins, but not directly in the ancestry of Abraham himself. And yet what prominent place does someone like Ruth play in God's plan of salvation?
She's an ancestor of Jesus.
Yeah, Ruth was the mother of Obed, and Obed was the father of Jesse, and Jesse is the father of David. She's great grandma. From the outside of the Jewish people, and then you get that would be, if you go back in time further, Jericho. Rahab, right? Rahab's a Canaanite. That was the people that God said, when you Israelites get to Canaan, you wipe those people out. You leave nobody alive. They have become so unbearable that they are essentially, at this point in history, ready for Judgment Day. But Rahab is preserved. And Rahab marries into a Judahite family, and I don't remember the name at the time, but she is also in the ancestry of Christ. So it's not as though God had forsaken all these people, but there wasn't mission work from the Jews to the world like there is from Christians to the world now. God was working at preserving his plan of salvation, the promise of the Savior, keeping the true faith alive at least among one people, whether they liked it or not. And as often as not, God had to drag these people back to himself, kicking and screaming after they tried to run away from him. In I think it's Isaiah, he says, what other people is in the practice of always forsaking their gods? If you go to the Phoenicians, they don't run away from Baal. They just embrace that worship all the time. If you go to any of the other gods, they're not running away from their religion. They just practice it generation after generation after generation. You Jewish people, I can hardly hold on to you. You're always trying to go to some other gods. Well, because this is the only God of law and gospel. This is the only God who's actually about morals. And at least that's a big part of, where it's not just about do your magic and make the God happy and have fertile earth or something like that. And so the Jews found Baal worship or Asherah worship or worship of the sun, moon, and stars often more appealing. It was fun. That was fun church. You go to the temple, you get the bloody sacrifice stuff. The prophets telling us that we're sinners. Who wants that? Go to the Baal worship, you got temple prostitution. Woohoo! That was fun church, right? Stir us up, get us happy. Anyway, so that's what happened historically there. So, but the root of the faith, that went all the way back to the creation of the world, and that's where Christians are now. They're in that line, and the Jewish faith from Jesus back was in that line. It was basically same faith. You will say then, branches are broken off so I could be grafted in. Granted, but they were broken off because of unbelief. So the problem is not a matter of ethnicity. The problem is a matter of faith or no faith. And those who did not put their faith in Christ were removed. You stand by faith. Do not be arrogant, be afraid, for if God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either. It's not as though it's earlier in that whole conversation. So what does it mean then to be a child of Abraham? What does it mean to be part of Israel in the spiritual sense? It's not as though God's word had failed. So Paul is talking about, again, this problem of the Jewish people not embracing Jesus. For not all who are descended from Israel are Israel. That is a key thought in New Testament theology. Not all who are descended from Israel are Israel. Not in the sense of God's people. Because even in the Old Testament, God's true people were always the ones by faith, not by birth. Nor because they are his descendants are they all Abraham's children. So God had promised Abraham that I'll make you the father of many nations. And your offspring will be like the stars in the sky. But we can't associate that merely with Jewish people, with the children of Israel. Because they are his descendants, that does not necessarily mean they are Abraham's children. Because the real children of Abraham are those who share the faith of Abraham. If you go back to chapter 4 in Romans, Paul makes a point of the fact that we are just as much Abraham's children. And Robert and I did that little ditty that you might have learned in Sunday school a few weeks back when we were talking about this. Father Abraham had many sons, and many sons had Father Abraham. I am one of them, and so are you. As far as I know, there's not a drop of Jewish blood in me. As far as I know, I don't know, something could have happened back there in Germany in the 1800s or 1700s if you do the family tree long enough. But as far as I know, it's Christian roots that go back as far as we can trace. But I am a descendant of Abraham in this sense. On the contrary, it's through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. And the point is, you had in other words, well, here is the point. It is not the natural children who are God's children, but it is the children of the promise, the ones who believe the gospel. That's who the real children are, who are regarded as Abraham's offspring. So you have to get rid of this idea about the importance of the DNA, the ethnicity. Again, and this isn't to be anti-Jewish. This isn't to say that it's okay to persecute them, to defend the Holocaust or the pogroms and the other things that they had to go through. They are human beings and they ought to be loved as much as anybody else. And as I said earlier, they are part of all nations and the gospel is for them no less than anybody else. We recognize they once did play a special role in God's plan, and thus it's proper that we try to evangelize them, but understand who they truly are. Okay, so here's the Romans 4 passage. Therefore, the promise comes by faith, so that it may be by grace and may be guaranteed to all Abraham's offspring, not only to those who are of the law, think ethnicity, but also to those who are of the faith of Abraham. And again, Paul's writing this to the Romans. For the most part, Gentile people living in Rome, not in Israel, right? This is his letter to the Romans. He, Abraham, is the father of us all. As it is written, I've made you a father of many nations. He is our father in the sight of God, in whom he believed, the God who gives life to the dead and calls the things that are as though they that are not as though they were. So again, to be a real child of Abraham is to have the faith of Abraham. Okay, so you're getting the point. I'm bringing passage after passage in part because people will often argue this point. And this is not like based on some isolated, hard to understand passage in one place in the New Testament. It is spread around. Ephesians 2, this is what God was doing. Therefore remember that formerly you who are Gentiles by birth and called uncircumcised by those who call themselves a circumcision, the Jewish people, that done in the body by the hands of men, remember that at that time you were separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel, and foreigners to the covenants of the promise, without hope and without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, you who once were far away have been brought near through the blood of Christ. So as mission work in the New Testament went out, the Gentile people, for the most part, as far as I know, in this congregation, your ancestors were brought near as that work was done. When I was in Dallas, I had two people who had Jewish blood in them. So then they could talk about the other side, right? And they were Christians, so they were also children of Abraham, just like us, right? But so the Gentiles were brought near with the preaching of the gospel to them, even though once they had been excluded. He, that is Jesus himself, is our peace. Now the idea is, although it would be true that he's our peace with God, and there's plenty of passages to support that, the idea here is that Jews and Gentiles used to be like this. You know, the Jews had no respect for Gentile people whatsoever. And the Gentiles felt about the same. The Gentiles just thought the Jewish people were like, you know, they had like a third eye. They were weird. You know, their food laws were weird. The best foods they couldn't eat. Weird laws about what they touched and the kind of clothing that they wore. And just none of that made sense. And then a whole set of morals that didn't go along with Gentile thinking at all. They were just strange. And so they didn't like each other. But in bringing them together in the gospel to one faith, not only did Christianity unite people from all strata of society, so that rich people and poor people, members of the emperor's household and slaves, would call each other brother and sister as though they're family. That was almost scandalous. But Jesus brought them together as one. And then across these ethnic lines. So that the peace he's talking about is that peace which is uniting the church, the people from all kinds of different backgrounds, in this case the Gentiles. He himself is our peace, who's made the two one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by abolishing in his flesh the law with its commandments and regulations. So what made those Jews seem so weird? It was the law, the ceremonial law. Don't eat fish. Don't eat shrimp or shellfish. Don't eat pork. Don't eat bugs. You had to strain the gnat out of your soup. You couldn't just swallow it. And don't wear mixed fiber clothing. Wool linen or wool cotton blend. That would have been no. It had to be all the same. And all the laws about what made you ceremonially unclean. Well, that made the Jews weird to the Gentiles, and it also was the reason, because the Gentiles didn't practice it, that the Jews had no respect for these scofflaws who didn't care about the true God, right? So, but Jesus took that down by fulfilling it for us. His purpose was to create in himself one new man out of the two, thus making peace. Consequently, you're no longer foreigners and aliens, but fellow citizens with God's people, members of God's household, built on the foundation of the apostles, and it's not just New Testament, and prophets, which Jesus Christ himself is the chief cornerstone. Okay. All right, so I'm belaboring this a little bit, but again, I want you to understand that this is not some isolated passage that we've grabbed and twisted. This is the common New Testament teaching all throughout, and thus we understand that the Jewish people no longer play that special role they once did, but they are still included in all nations and wanted by God as believers in the gospel. Okay, this I didn't put the reference. This is from 1 Peter chapter 2. See, I lay in a stone in Zion, a chosen and precious cornerstone. The one who trusts in him will never be put to shame. Reference to Jesus from the prophet Isaiah. Now to those who believe, the stone is precious. But to those who do not believe, the stone the builders rejected has become the capstone, and a stone that causes men to stumble, and a rock that makes them fall. So these are all Old Testament prophecies that Peter is latching on to, showing that among his own people, and Peter, of course, is Jewish, it's not like he's practicing some kind of racial discrimination here, that among his own people they rejected the Messiah, and the eventual result is that they stumble and fall. They stumble because they disobey the message, which is also what they were destined for. Going on. But you, speaking now to the Gentiles, you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation of people belonging to God. Now it's almost fighting words, inasmuch as all of that verbiage comes out of the Old Testament applied to Israel. So he is saying to the Gentiles now, all those things that God said about Israel at Mount Sinai and through the law of Moses and through the prophets, that all applies to you now. You're a chosen people. Gentiles. You are a royalty. You are a priesthood. You're a holy nation of people that belong to God. All of that was applied to Israel, it applies to New Testament Christians. It's you. It's me, right? Okay, so one last one. To the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again. I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. So here John in the book of Revelation, well actually it's Christ speaking through John in the book of Revelation, recognizes that just because a person has that background and calls themselves this does not necessarily make it so. Okay, I'm not going to hit all these passages. They stand on their own as they are, and they were part of the post, though. All right, questions on that last concept? So before we run into the just war doctrine part, I just want to run through. So does this mean that we should oppose the secular political nation of Israel? Does this justify Christian hatred of Jewish people? No. On what should we base our regard for modern day political Israel?
They're tough.
Political.
Okay.
They're tough SOBs. They've been around for 2,000 years.
Okay.
They've got little tough hides, and they're really smart, and if you mess with them, it'll cost you.
They have survived. They have had the world against them, and they have survived. They are good fighters. They make, so if they're on your side, you've probably got an ally that's scrappy and is going to be good that way. But in terms of as a political entity, the same rules that we would apply to how we regard any nation on earth, right? Are they taking good care of their citizens? Are they being just in how they act? So can we criticize Israel if they are being unjust, or if they were fighting offensive wars against people for purposes only of expansion? Can we criticize Israel then?
Yeah.
Yeah. If they're defending themselves,
I know.
oh, well then, it's the same standard we would apply to them as anybody else. They don't get a free pass just because of the role that they played in biblical times. They would stand alongside every other nation in that sense. Okay. So that means that it's not as though there's never anything to criticize there. And if there is some issue with whether or not real justice is or fairness is a part of their policies as they deal with the peoples around them, yeah, criticize away. But based on objective standards of right and wrong, just as we might even do with our own government. But we don't give them a free pass because of their past place in God's designs. Okay. As Christians, what should be our goal with Jewish people we meet?
Love them.
Love them and
Share the gospel.
yeah, bring them to faith, right? Make them brothers and sisters in Christ. But they don't have this special role to play they once did. That has been fulfilled when Jesus came. And thus, because they don't have that special role, we don't look to the events to be current events, to be a specific harbinger of Christ's return. In what way is it you can put this in the study, in what way is it a an indication that that we're in the last times. Anybody remember what Jesus said it would be like in the last days?
Wars and rumors.
Wars and rumors of wars, right? Kingdom will turn against kingdom, nation against nation. Okay, so we got that going on. So in that sense, but no less so or no more so than Ukraine, Russia, right? That is also an indicator of the fact that we are living in these days that God said we would. It is frankly a part of the Great Tribulation. And life is tough. And bad things are happening. And the devil seems to be ruling here. He is the usurper who seems to have the upper hand so often. In that sense, it's an indication that we should be ready for Jesus' return at any time. But it is not a special indicator. Okay, so this is the addendum I wanted to go through, just war doctrine. When God's Old Testament people had to go to war, they did so generally at God's own direction. They didn't have to think about this a lot. Just like they didn't have to think of most of their lives. God treated them like minor children in the household. They didn't have to sort things out because God had it sorted, and he would send them a prophet and tell them what to do. Well, generally speaking, we would say that an offensive war is wrong. But in one case, God said, okay, here I'm doing something exceptional. The Canaanites, I'm done working with them. So just go take care of them. But that is not the kind of thing that generally you have any commission to do unless it came with a direct word from God. And that was the one time, and only time that I know of in world history that God's ever done something like that. So that's by far the exception. We do not have the right to go on the war path, no matter how bad we think the other guys are, in an offensive manner, right? Well, we'll talk about the just war doctrine a little bit more. But Israel had God to tell them when to go to war. When the Christians first appeared on the scene after Jesus, then they were a minority, and they weren't in positions of leadership or governing for the most part. And it wasn't until Constantine made the Christian religion legal, and then some years later, it actually became the state-sponsored religion in the Roman Empire in the late 300s. The Christians now had to figure something out, and that is, okay, so now we've got the reins of government. And governments have been going to war forever, and it doesn't seem to be avoidable. How do we sort this? Augustine, who lived in the late hundreds to the early to, I don't know exactly what his death date is. He lived into the 400s. 420, is that about his death date? About so early
10 years.
Early 400s. Anyway, so he writes a book called The City of God, and he's comparing God's work in the church, which is the city of God, and God's work in society. It's the beginning of what in the Lutheran Church we call two kingdoms doctrine. That God really has two kingdoms he administrates here on earth. One directly in the church through his word, and the other one, it's not that his hand is not in it in the same way. Well, it's not that his hand is in it, but it's a different. That one works by reason and force, not by the gospel. So the government has different tools that has been given to carry out its work than the church has, and the church is not to get mixed up too much in the business of the other. Now, the individual Christian has to live in both. And so as an individual Christian, I am both citizen and church member. And so I have to remember which cap I'm wearing as I do my thing as citizen or even elected official on the one hand, or as member of my congregation on the other. In the church, it's about love and the gospel. In the government, it is about force and law. Two different principles for government. When it comes to making war, Augustine sorted through these 6 principles as things for the government to consider if the Christians are going to be as a part of it to the degree that they can influence it. And just generally considering what is moral. So the gospel isn't so much in view here as the law, because we are in that other kingdom. But what is moral here? So first of all, the purpose of war is to restore peace. The object of war is to vindicate justice. 2, war should be waged only as a last resort. In other words, you try to take every other avenue you can before you go to it. War is waged only under the authority of the ruler, and only those in public life could take life. So, generally speaking, the 5th commandment says, you shall not murder. But we recognize that God has made generally one exception to taking life, and it's not murder then, but that he has delegated the right to end life to those who are governing authorities when it is necessary to keep the peace and to protect the innocent. And that may take several forms. That's why we have police force, and we are not bothered by the fact that the police all have a sidearm and a billy club, and they may use physical and even deadly force at times in order to enforce law. Right? It's Romans 13. The government will also raise an army to defend its borders and protect its citizens, and that is legitimate. And in the taking of life, it may well be necessary under such circumstances. And we don't feel that that is a betrayal of biblical principle. Christian pacifism is not a legitimate biblical position. It just isn't. You can't defend it. It is an attempt to take Jesus' passages when he talks to the individual Christian about how you live as a Christian. So it confuses the two kingdoms, and it confuses the institution with the individual. And so when Jesus talks about turning the other cheek, etc., if the governing authority turns the other cheek, it sins. Because it is failing in its duty to protect, and it harms, not loves, its neighbor. Okay, so I understand how the people who take the position get there, but it is a naivete and a lack of grasping what the scriptures teach. Even in John the Baptist's day, the soldiers came when John was preaching repentance, and some of them didn't feel good about their job, and they said, what should we do? And John didn't say, resign your commission in the army. He said, don't use your position to abuse your authority and extort people. But he didn't tell them to stop doing what they do. War is waged, so only under the authority of the ruler. The rulers have to, which also means, a vigilantism, where, just a group of citizens try to arrange themselves against the government. That's a problem also, right? They have not been given that authority. It's not been delegated to them, generally speaking. That is for the authority. 4, the conduct of war must be just. Minimum force should be applied. In other words, you try to accomplish what you have to accomplish with the least loss of life that you can possibly arrange for. Wanton violence, profanation of temples. So even though these were Christians, Augustine was a Christian, he recognized, it makes no sense to go to war against the other people's religion. It confuses the two kingdoms. It doesn't understand how Christianity spreads. Conversion at the end of a knife or a sword or a gun is no true conversion anyway. It's not how we operate. And any attempt to force Christianity into a person or out of a person is a failure, and it ought not to be done with war. So leave their objects of worship alone. You make more trouble for the gospel than you help that way. Looting, vengeance, atrocities, reprisals are excluded. Now, in the actual practice of war, you recognize these are high ideals that are never met. Right? As with all the law, it sets a standard that humans don't reach. But at least in theory, you can say this is how a Christian person would understand what you have to do if you're serving in the kingdom of the left, the kingdom of the world, the kingdom of governing, and that's what was going on. 5, a just war is always between equals. Don't bully and pick on the little guy, right? The nations don't have to be exactly the same size, but it should be between nations. An underlying assumption is that one party in a war represents the right and the good. Now, with that one, what's going to be the problem for the Christian citizen?
How do I know if Bosnia and the guys are just as, wantonly massacring each other on both sides? How do I possibly know if it's the Serbs or the whoever the other guy was?
Yeah.
How could I possibly know that?
So understand that when you get into this, both governments get the propaganda machine running, right? And so, I mean, nothing against our current government. It's the best I think we got in the world. But understand that our government would be just as much running a propaganda show as anybody. And sometimes that gets exposed too.
I agreed with the one in Serbia and stuff. I mean,
Oh yeah, no, right.
I mean, but nobody knew. But it wasn't automatic.
It's
was
hard to
like-
sort out.
hard to sort it out. It's
Yeah.
like they're both butcher one another for
Yeah,
ever.
yeah. Previous point 4 about looting, vengeance, atrocities, reprisals. That kind of stuff. It's the nature when people go to fight. It's the self-control is not the main thing the soldier is concerned about very often, right? It's killing as many of the enemy as possible. And bad things happen. But anyway, so you as much as you can discern it, you want to try to ferret that out. But that's going to be difficult because as the individual citizen, it will be hard to get the information you need to make the call. All right, so that was with Augustine. That's some 1,600 years old or so. Go ahead, Caleb.
What do you mean by the purpose of war is to restore peace? Like with the Ukraine and Russian war, if Russia took land from Ukraine and claimed it as their own, could Ukraine take that land back to restore peace, or would it not be counted as restoring peace?
Yeah, so it's a country that is defending itself, I think, as far as we can discern here, right? And even that one, I think if you've read under the surface a little bit, it's more complicated than a person might think. It's not completely clear lines, but I think generally speaking, we favor Ukraine of the two. So Ukraine is defending its territory, right? Russia has invaded, and part of defending the territory would be, the battle lines are going to move back and forth, but to restore to where it originally was, and then to have peace for the people inside. So, you want to get to the end of the war. You don't want to make this something that just goes on and on and on. You want to get the other. You don't want an endless stalemate where the fighting continues. You want a winner and a loser, and you want it to be done so that people can get back to living their lives. Some of the wars our own country has gotten into in the last, say, half century or so, there's been some question about whether anybody really thought through, how do we get to that point? And sometimes I think, okay, so now there's a little bit of just war doctrine here maybe, but a little bit just Pastor Vietz's opinion, so take it as you will. A defensive war where you're just going to, the enemy invades and you're just going to try to maintain your borders and nothing else is going to be really hard to bring to a conclusion. There is a sense in which to win the war, you're probably going to have to drive all the way to the enemy's capital to be done. Or you're going to be doing it for decades because you're going to try to slowly bleed them out. The wars in Southeast Asia, unless we were willing to go to Hanoi or Pyongyang to end it, they were just going to go on, right? And as long as you're just going to try to maintain here, well, the other side is what they're trying to drive all the way through. What motivation do they have just to say, well, okay, enough? That's going to be a long time. So as part of the defense, you may have to go on offense eventually. And this is where it starts to get messy in terms of the motivations and justifications behind it.
It just seems like that minimum force to be applied is completely counter to what military doctrine says. They say overwhelming force is what wins wars, not using the minimum to get to your end goal.
So all of this gets a little messy, yes, and so the minimum force necessary may be a lot of force, right? But sometimes going whole hog is long-term going to be the least. But yeah,
So in a just war, like, say, World War II, where they just started firebombing and leveling German cities to the ground, might not have been the minimum force necessary.
correct, correct, yeah. So we often talk about what happened to Japan with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and people debate back and forth whether the use of the atomic bomb was justified in those cases, and our president justified it because it was going to mean that much less for loss of American lives, and the Japanese as a people were, it was not in their culture to surrender. That was not in their culture. They had the idea that every last citizen fought till every last citizen was dead. That was honorable. They had no respect for a POW because because if you surrendered, it was like, what kind of a man are you? You fight to the death. That's what you do. Okay. So that all entered into the conversation and consideration.
Well, you firebombed Tokyo. I mean, you killed more people in Tokyo in one night than
Sure.
you did that. So what's the difference between burning people to death in 12 hours versus 15 minutes? It's really none.
So understand, these are fairly high principles that are hard to apply. But at least the ruler would want to have this in mind, right? Firebombing of Dresden would be a case where pretty good argument can be made for that's just Churchill's revenge. There didn't seem to be any real legitimate, and there's supposed to be a ball bearing factory in the town somewhere. But long after there was anything to put the ball bearings in, right? What are you going to do with that? It was a lot of German citizens who died for not really any good purpose, it would appear. But we deal with the information we have. It's a messy thing. In the big picture, it would seem there was a pretty clear offensive side and a pretty clear defensive side, right? Modern tweaks to it. One, it must be a declared war waged by a legitimate authority. Whatever channels the nation has defined for making decisions of this sort must be observed. Two, the cause must be just. This is usually understood to mean the nation must defend itself against attack, preserving an order that serves its citizens and preserving the lives of innocent citizens. So we have an issue with today. As much we want to go against combatants, not individual citizens, as much as possible. There must be a right intention or attitude. This is particularly important to Augustine, who believed a Christian should not enter war with a spirit of hatred or vindictiveness. All right, good luck. Often the propaganda machine wants to do the opposite, right? Dehumanize the other side. That's what they're shooting for. Make people mad at the other side so they're willing to kill them. It must be the last resort. Every peaceful means of resolving international problems must be vigorously pursued. Okay, but when do you know that it's the last resort? Again, you can put that on paper pretty easily, but coming to the conclusion that you've reached it is a challenge. 5, there must be a reasonable hope of success. It's irresponsible to go to war if there is no realistic prospect of a nation successfully defending itself. So it's not that the nation may not have a just cause, but if all you're going to do is kill a lot of people and you're going to be defeated anyway, what have you accomplished? The good likely to be achieved by victory must outweigh the possible evil effects. This is the norm of proportionality. So you hear about proportionality in responses to military actions today very often. Even if a nation believes its prospects for winning the war are good, the cost in terms of loss of life and massive destruction may not warrant the conflict. The right means must be employed in the conduct of the war. This is a norm of discrimination. A nation is responsible for avoiding acts that show a wanton disregard for life. This means that there are legitimate and illegitimate military targets. Okay, this starts to enter into what's going on in Gaza today, right? That's debated back and forth. Is this a legitimate, okay, so you shouldn't bomb a hospital, but the hospital has been set up as headquarters, supposedly so at least, for the other side. What do you do with that? It's not simple. The distinction between combatants and non-combatants must be observed, and prisoners of war must be treated humanely. Now also understand, these are Christian principles. They are not necessarily adopted by all governments. They tend to be Western, but there are a lot of Eastern cultures that would not necessarily agree to any of this. And you have to recognize that when you're waging war also. Not everybody is signed up for this. This is a specifically Christian approach, and to the degree that it's Christian, it is seeped into Western thought. But we aren't everybody, not nearly.
It's,
Yes.
everybody thinks, when you think about Hiroshima, you gotta remember there's like 10,000 people in Southeast Asia who are non-white, non-European that are dying every day, that the war continues to be waged. So, I mean, it's a little different if you look at the bigger picture, which, no, we didn't want to go into China and wage a land war in China, but there were people being killed at a massive rate. And so it's like, what was the choice? You let that go on for the next 20 years?
Generally, I'm not critical of Truman, personally. I'm not critical of Truman for making the decision. I think it was probably a good decision overall. I'm just saying, it's messy. And I'm going to guess he lost a bunch of sleep in trying to make it.
It was very messy, and it wasn't,
Yeah.
nobody is really happy.
So understand, these are all very high-level principles. In practice, they're going to be difficult. And my last question here, we need to wrap up. What's the challenge for the individual Christian citizen or soldier in assessing a just cause of war? And that is, you recognize that the information you're getting is tainted or likely to be tainted. And getting to a truly objective view is just hard. And we probably have to give a little grace and forgiveness to not only our leaders, but maybe even fellow citizens who may not come to the same conclusion in any given case. Luther would say, if you're unsure, well, then you should freely just follow the idea that you, as a citizen of your country, obey your authority. And with a good conscience, go to fight for your side if you're unsure in some way.
My husband was in the Air Force for 30 years, and he went to Korea and Vietnam.
Yeah,
Maybe he not always agreed what the war was about, but if he just continued, they would put him in prison. He has to fight.
sure.
So you have no choice there.
Sometimes you have no choice. There were people who
And then he
fled.
died for it.
I mean, there were some people who fled to Canada.
Some went to Canada.
Yeah, and wasn't seen as an honorable choice, but if you have legitimate issues of conscience, we have to probably provide a little bit of grace towards their decision. You probably have to hear the person out as to what they were thinking. Were they just cowardly? Not a good reason. Or were they actually legitimately convinced that there just was not a just war? People who write about this say that as a Christian, then, if you come to the conclusion against your government, you have to accept whatever consequences come to you. If that means prison, it means prison. Sorry, that's how life goes. I'm not here to say whether the Southeast Asian wars that we fought or the East Asian wars we fought were wrong. It's complex, right? It's complex, very complex. So you have to sort it. So he fought honorably and served his country, and that is only to be respected. All right, so thank you for your time with this study. We'll pick up back with Upside Down Spirituality next week and continue with chapter 3 of that book.